This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK. This is the BBC.
Did you know that if you hand over £2 million, you could pay your way towards a UK passport in just 5 years, and it's completely legal? In this week's File on 4, Ailís Hart examines the global citizenship by investment industry and asks if the UK investment visa scheme is open to abuse, a way for fraudsters and laundered money to enter Britain.
I'm about to speak to a man in the Caribbean who works in the passport trade. He helps get second citizenships for the super rich.
Hello?
Oh, hello. I'm looking to speak with Nuri Katz, please.
Yes, this is Nuri.
Hi, how are you doing? It's Ailís in the UK.
Yes, how are you?
I'm not too bad. I believe you're the man to speak to.
I'm one of them.
But this is not the black market. This is entirely legal.
You see people buying fancy cars, and then they buy fancy houses, and then they get the fancy boat and the fancy plane. And so there are those who just think that having a second passport is a status symbol.
Paying your way to a second passport is called citizenship by investment. The idea is simple. Invest huge sums of money and in return acquire citizenship of that country, and with it, visa-free access to scores of other countries around the world.
Countries like the UK and the US and Canada have programs whereby if you invest a certain amount, for example in the UK it's £2 million, you can come and live in the UK and eventually become a citizen of the UK. Whether it's fair or not, money certainly buys a lot of freedom.
Arranging residency or citizenship by investment, sometimes known as golden visas, is a growing industry around the world, with an annual turnover running into billions. But with immigration so high on the political agenda, some feel being able to obtain citizenship by virtue of wealth is inherently unfair.
At a time when we're debating the Windrush generation, they've lived in this country for 40, 50 years. They've worked tirelessly for those 40 or 50 years, and yet they're having their residency, their citizenship challenged. On the other hand, if I turn up tomorrow with £2 million, in 3 or 4 or 5 years' time, I can have residency in the United Kingdom, no questions asked. That seems distasteful, that dichotomy.
And is the UK visa scheme open to abuse, a way for fraudsters and laundered money to enter Britain?
We believe that it's extremely likely that the scheme was used to bring dirty money into the UK. With a lot of these schemes, the checks and balances just aren't there. The regulation just isn't sufficient, that these schemes are being abused by those wanting to hide corrupt and illicit wealth and wanting to run away from the consequences of their corrupt activity.
In the UK, the scheme is officially called the Tier 1 Investor Visa. For a £2 million investment, you can get residency and even full citizenship after 5 years. But the more money you have, the quicker it is. So for £5 million, you can settle in the UK after 3 years, stump up £10 million, and that becomes 2. We don't know much about who comes in on these visas because the list of names is kept a secret. But there was a case before the High Court in London which cast some light on one case in particular. It starts here, one of the most expensive addresses in London, involves industrial-scale international bank fraud and ends with dirty money being used to pay for a UK golden visa.
Well, we've come here many times over the years, as you can imagine. Normally, crooks and fraudsters that we're chasing living streets like this all over London.
Trevor Williams is a private investigator at Diligence, a corporate intelligence firm that conducts complex cross-border investigations. He was working on this elaborate fraud case when the trail led him to this address in North London. From this side of the gate, we can't see that much, but an old estate agent's brochure gives me an insight into the opulence. Inside, there's a sweeping marble staircase, a 50-foot ballroom, and a private dining room which, it says, gives unlimited potential for grand entertaining.
We were brought in to investigate where the missing $5 to $10 billion were. During that investigation, we unwound a labyrinth of over 3,000 companies, and one of those companies gave money which eventually was used to purchase a golden visa.
Trevor Williams chases assets and money around the world. He was brought in to investigate the whereabouts of billions of pounds that had gone missing from the BTA Bank in Kazakhstan. His target was a man called Mukhtar Ablyazov.
He was the chairman of BTA Bank. He'd increased the capital of the bank by various rounds of funding, and it was one of the most prominent banks in Kazakhstan. And during the banking crisis, the assessment was made and the bank was failing, and auditors and accountants were brought in to look at the balance sheet of the bank, and a quick assessment of that showed that there was between $5 and $10 billion missing from the bank, and it had been wired out in loans to fictitious companies, offshore companies with no trading history. Had been loaned hundreds of millions of pounds.
£5 to £10 billion missing.
Yes, 5 to 10 billion.
Mukhtar Ablyazov fled Kazakhstan, he says, as a political exile and took up residence in London on what's become known as a billionaire's row. Investigator Trevor Williams had to prove this lavish lifestyle was being funded by the missing money. It involved painstaking surveillance.
So how long were you watching this house?
Yeah, I think we were probably in total in the area for about a year, at least a year.
How do you stake out a house for a year?
I think you just have to limit your exposure in terms of how much you're in and around the house versus how often you can be further down the road.
So a bit more complicated than sitting across the road with a newspaper open?
Yeah, it has long, boring, tedious work. So.
By now, investigators were using a nearby cafe as a meeting point, and the surveillance had paid off. They found Mr. Ablyazov was using a storage facility near his home called Yellow Box, and they'd noticed late-night visits to the warehouse. They were convinced that inside would be clues to where the missing money had gone, so they secured a civil seizure order to raid the lockup.
I think everyone was very anxious at the time. We were hoping that we hadn't got it wrong, hoping that we weren't just going to open the door to find nothing there. So we went to the Yellow Box facility and we served the order on the young receptionist. He had a look who was the nominated representative and phoned them. We were waiting for someone to come and nobody did. And therefore we proceeded on and we moved up onto the third floor with a large pair of bolt cutters.
So there you are, you spent years tracking this man. When they open the doors or pull up the shutters, what do you find?
It's just full of boxes. It's just full of square legal boxes and what look like computer servers and all sorts of papers and documents. Effectively, I think it broke the back of the case. It's sort of the jackpot.
What he found was a veritable treasure map. Papers and computer files that allowed analysts to trace how the money had been lost from the bank. A cascade of transactions ended up at a company called Sunstone Ventures, registered in the British Virgin Islands. And among eye-watering financial flows, they noticed that just over £1 million of this money had been gifted to Mr. Ablyazov's teenage son, Madiar. When they traced the money even further, they discovered that a few years earlier, in 2009, his son had used this money to pay for a Tier 1 investor visa, and with it, a route to British citizenship.
The money moved down through a structure of companies, and companies such as Sunstone would be at the end. And they do that by loaning intercompany loans. One company would then loan to another company, then would loan to another company, so they'd move it through a series of loans. Sunstone then gave money to a Swiss bank account in the name of both Mukhtar and his son, and then eventually the money is given to his son as a gift.
So money that is arguably proceeds of crime has been gifted to his son and then passed over to get citizenship.
Yeah, exactly, yes.
So the money that was used, in your view, that's dirty money?
100%.
So the Home Office has almost unwittingly laundered money?
Yes, that's the case.
That's a pretty extraordinary allegation, one we put directly to the Home Office, but they didn't answer our question. Mukhtar Ablyazov has been the subject of extensive litigation in the High Court, with more than £5 billion of judgments awarded against him. An appeal court judge was pretty scathing in his assessment of him.
It is difficult to imagine a party to commercial litigation who has acted with more cynicism, opportunism and deviousness than Mr. Ablyazov.
Mukhtar Ablyazov fled the UK when he was told he was being jailed for contempt of court. He's now living in France. Through his lawyers, he told us the allegations were politically driven by a corrupt Central Asian regime where there is no rule of law. He says he wasn't siphoning money from the bank. On the contrary, he says BTA Bank was unlawfully nationalised and pillaged by the Kazakh government, and he was, in fact, protecting the assets from them. Mr. Ablyazov also denies the money gifted to his son was in any way dirty. There's no suggestion his son Madiar was involved in the fraud. His lawyer said he adhered to all required standards and was open about where the money came from. But there are mounting concerns that the UK's investor scheme is an easy hiding place for illicit funds.
Corrupt individuals will find it really hard to steal public money, for example, if they don't have a safe place to hide it and a safe place to run to. And because of the way the golden visa system was set up here, I believe the UK was essentially providing that safe place.
Rachel Davies-Teka is head of advocacy at the anti-corruption campaign group Transparency International UK. The Tier 1 investor visa was introduced in 2008. She says for the first 7 years, the Home Office operated on a period of blind faith, thinking, erroneously as it turned out, that others were doing the necessary checks.
Through our investigations and our research, we discovered that no real anti-money laundering checks were done on the source of this wealth during those 7 years, which of course gives us a lot of reason for concern.
And when you say there were no checks, who wasn't doing the checks?
So we interviewed officials at the Home Office. They said, well, in the initial 7 years of the scheme, we would actually grant the visa before the individuals invested the money, and we would just trust that the financial institutions would do what they usually do and do the usual anti-money laundering checks. Now, when we went to speak to people in the financial institutions, they told us, well, actually, if you're looking at an individual and they were coming through on this scheme and we possibly had some concerns, we would say, hang on a second, the Home Office has already given them a visa. I'm sure they've done the checks. I'm sure it's fine. And those checks weren't carried out.
Almost 3,000 people came into the UK during that period, bringing with them at least £3 billion. At a time, Rachel Davies-Teka believes it was highly vulnerable to abuse. More than half the visas went to applicants from Russia and China, countries with a high corruption risk. In 2014-15, the Home Office tightened the rules. The investment doubled to $2 million, and all applicants would have to use a UK bank account, putting the onus on the financial services sector to do the necessary checks. Rachel Davies-Teka believes this blind faith period opened the door to criminality.
What was really concerning to us is there's very little transparency over the 3,000 individuals that invested in the UK during the blind faith period. And we have asked the Home Office for information on, OK, how many of these political officials or associates? Can you give us the names of these individuals so we can cross-check against people we know who've been involved in corruption and illicit activity? But the Home Office hasn't published that information. So we're a bit in the dark, really. But at Transparency International, we have a high degree of suspicion that there was dirty money coming in through this scheme.
Last month, the Commons Foreign Affairs Committee accused the UK of turning a blind eye to illicit funds coming in from Russia in particular. The Home Office say, after the rule change, applications for the Tier 1 plummeted by 84%. They said they're now taking another look at how the scheme works and running further checks on those who came in before the reforms. In the Mayfair offices of immigration law firm Weskin Associates, the signs are the super wealthy heading to Britain still receive a light touch service.
So this is where we keep the paper versions of our applications. So I've picked up here an entrepreneur application and a Tier 1 investor.
There's a huge difference in size. One is, I'd say 50 to 100 pages, and one is like a full lever arch file.
Yeah, you can see obviously the entrepreneur visa has 4 requirements, whereas the investor only has 1. And the majority of this in the entrepreneur application is basically the applicant having to prove themselves to the Home Office. Whereas with the investor, the reason why it's so so slim, and most of it being the application form itself is because there's only one requirement, and that is completely objective.
It's just your bank statements.
Yeah, you could put it that way.
Lawyer Human Mayer handles the full spectrum of immigration applications, anything from asylum to entrepreneurs, but he specialises in the UK Tier 1 investor visa. He says compared to the others, it's altogether a lot more straightforward.
So the investor visa is like no other visa in essence. It only has one requirement, and that requirement is, do you have 2 million? It's a completely objective visa, unlike all other visa applications which have some form of subjectivity. Of course, there's still going to be standard checks like criminality and anti-money laundering. But yeah, if you have the money, they'll give you the visa.
And what kind of checks do other people who are coming in on, say, an entrepreneurial visa, what do they have to do that you don't have to do on an investor visa?
So those are much more stringent. So with entrepreneurs looking to invest in a UK company, and that's still 200,000, so it's a fair amount, they will have to provide a business plan, they will have to provide evidence of their experience, they'll most probably have to do an interview. Even if the funds are in their account, they'll be questioned of how they obtain these funds. So there's a lot more subjectivity compared to the investor visa.
Golden visas, for want of a better term, are more popular amongst people who come from countries that have higher risk of corruption than others. Do you think that's just a coincidence?
I think it is a coincidence. If you live in a country that has corruption, you probably want to get away from that corruption, especially if you're a high net worth individual. That's not to say that you are involved in the corruption yourself, but you might want to come to a safe haven where you feel like you won't be impacted by that corruption. So there's definitely a correlation there, but I wouldn't say there's a causation.
The trade in second or third passports is a lucrative one, and one of the biggest players in the world is Henley and Partners. They help the super rich decide where to apply and advise governments who want to set up golden visa schemes of their own. Their website boasts of the magic combination of 14 passports that could, in theory at least, grant you visa-free access to the entire world.
More and more of us are becoming global citizens, and over the next 2 days, you will hear from those countries that have adapted, that have embraced this new reality, and I hope that all of you here will as well.
In 2016, they held their 10th annual conference at the Savoy in London, attended by the great and the good, including Hollywood actors and representatives from international governments.
We're happy that we're working now with Henley and Partners to create an even brighter future for our country.
So the firm has actually published a book which they describe as the quintessential guide for global citizens and their advisors, and we got our hands on a copy. And it looks exactly like a shopping catalogue. It offers citizenship of different countries ranked by traits like rule of law or tax arrangements, whatever it is that takes your fancy. It even says what the weather is like in Edinburgh, although I'm not sure that's its strongest selling point.
Flight LS931 to Malta.
Here in Europe, their biggest contract to date was signed with the Maltese government 4 years ago. So we're boarding a flight to the capital Valletta to find out more. Henley and Partners are positively evangelical about what the passport scheme has achieved here. They credit it with effectively reversing a budget deficit that's been in place for as long as statistics have existed, raising almost €400 million in the 12 months to July 17. And across the peninsula, there are clear signs an economic upturn is underway. We're on a boat crossing the harbour from Valletta towards Salima, which is one of the areas on the island experiencing a bit of a construction boom. You can see the skyline is dotted with cranes and there's lots of new high-rise apartments going up, aimed mostly at the wealthy newcomers. We're on our way to meet one of the scores of agents who advise them on the passport scheme.
So we're literally in the heart of St. Julian's. You've got over there the Porto Masso Tower. Good luck trying to find space there. You'd have to submit a request months, if not years ahead. You've got the 5-star Hilton. With that, you've got the lovely marina here with over 450 luxury apartments.
Ryan Dermanian works for Latitude Consultancy, one of the agents operating in the global citizenship market.
If you were to be interested in buying an apartment overlooking this marina, how much would it set you back?
You'll probably have to part with easily $500,000 if you're happy to go on the ground floor. The moment you want to have a better view, then you're north to $1 million for a 2-3 bedroom. And then obviously if you want to go higher and if you want to go in one of those penthouses, then you're looking upwards of $2 million.
It's hard to avoid just how much construction is going on at this part of the island. There's about 12, 13 different cranes in the sky just from where we're sat. The passport scheme, what impact do you think it has had economically?
What it has done is instill greater confidence in people. There's a feel-good factor. It's put Malta on the map.
Acquiring Maltese citizenship isn't cheap. There's an upfront fee of €650,000 which goes to the government, plus $25,000 each for kids and spouses. Once you include the fee and required property investments, we've been told the total bill is likely to be close to €1 million. But the scheme attracted vocal critics before the ink on the contract had a chance to dry.
When it was first introduced, there was an uproar. There was a reaction to the principle of selling citizenship. There was complaints about the appointment of Henley & Partners as its exclusive agents. And the European Commission itself also wanted to look into this idea that a country, a member state, could sell its citizenship with the only eligibility criterion effectively being the price they pay for it.
Manuel Delia is an activist and blogger in Malta. He says the initial disquiet about the scheme faded following a couple of tweaks, including a requirement that applicants be resident for a year before they could qualify for citizenship. But as he and others have found, this requirement is being, how should I put it, loosely interpreted. We're on our way to a small agricultural village in the north of the island, which I have to say is quite a stark contrast from the Baroque architecture of the capital. It seems it's enough for applicants to rent a property for a year without actually having to live in it. So Manuel is bringing me to see the address that's listed as the home of a Russian oil baron.
So we're coming up on Mjar now, and you can see it's residential village. The biggest building in the village is the church.
It's quite different from the luxury and the high-end streets of Valletta.
I would choose to live here because you want to live a quiet life and away from it all. That's not the choice you'd expect from an oil tycoon.
There's no super yachts around here?
No, there's no super yachts here.
Campaigners were able to test how the system worked when the government mistakenly released the names and addresses of a small number of applicants.
By some administrative error, at one point they leaked something like 80 addresses of these people, and we checked a few of them going around to see where these people are supposed to be living. So we are just outside a block of very modest apartments in the periphery of a very peripheral village of Mjar. So the residence is supposed to be at number 4. There's the letterbox broken. No letters can go in there. And the nameplate on the buzzer doesn't work. Nameplate is blank. Nobody answers.
This isn't just any Russian. This is a really, really wealthy oil tycoon.
Yes, you've pretty much described him.
Manuel Delia thinks an entire industry has evolved around creating the impression of residency on paper.
That allows them to simply, through their local agents, get someone to rent them a garage or an apartment. They never see it, they never visit it, they land on their private jet, get in the car, go to the passport office, sign the paper, collect the passport, fly back out. You're never heard from again.
We put all of this to the Maltese government, but they didn't respond. Henley & Partners, who helped design the scheme, say it's regarded as the best in the world. They don't run it. That's up to the Maltese government. But say stringent due diligence is done and applicants are required to show a number of genuine links with the country. That may be so, but for some time now, the scheme has been struggling to shake off allegations that it's open to abuse and corruption.
My mother didn't die in her bed. When they killed her, it was a declaration of war. And we've been at war ever since that day. Our lives have changed completely.
Daphne Caruana Galicia was Malta's most prominent investigative journalist. She was murdered late last year after a bomb detonated under her car.
There was really no one like my mother, and there still is no one like her. She was working on stories about political corruption, about crime and abuse and ethical failures at the highest levels of government in Malta. She scooped all of the country's newsrooms combined every week. Imagine 100 journalists versus a single woman.
Her son Matthew is also an investigative journalist. He says her work earned her many enemies. Any number of people may have wanted her silenced. While there is nothing to link it to her death, one of her final investigations was into the controversial passport scheme. She seemed convinced that it was vulnerable to cronyism and corruption, and began to zero in on the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, a man called Keith Schembri.
Malta's anti-money laundering authority began looking into transactions, and they found one transaction in particular which drew their attention.
So we have copies of the leaked reports that have been compiled by the government's financial investigators, and they make some pretty extraordinary claims about the Prime Minister's right-hand man. It says 3 Russian passport applicants together paid over €166,000 via an offshore firm into a personal account in Mr. Schembri's name. Now, all 3 payments referenced invoice numbers that were linked to the Maltese passport scheme. The opposition party have seized upon this and described the payments as kickbacks for the sale of passports.
They suspected that somehow the sale of Maltese passports was being made easier thanks to the interference of the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, and he was being paid for this in cash.
Mr. Schembri denies the allegations. He says they're politically motivated and part of a campaign of lies. We tried to contact him through the office of the Prime Minister, but we didn't get a response. He said in the past, though, that the transactions were repayments for a legitimate loan.
I was in the Parliament and we were shocked, really shocked. But some of us not really surprised in the sense that she had been subject to tremendous harassment and hate campaign.
After the assassination of Daphne Caruana Galicia, the European Parliament sent a delegation to Malta to investigate the rule of law, including the country's passport scheme. It was led by MEP Ana Gomez.
I directly questioned the Prime Minister when we met with him on the 1st of December. How could Mr. Keith Schembri still be in his government after the very serious revelations? I'm very concerned that these very serious allegations are leveled against a government and no action. It's really outrageous what is going on.
Despite 2 major reports from the government financial investigators, police didn't launch an investigation. Instead, a magistrate's inquiry was launched, but we've been told these can take years to conclude and their findings aren't always made public. The lack of action raises bigger questions for Ana Gomez.
You would expect the Prime Minister to be in control of his members, and you would expect the Prime Minister not to be subjecting his country and his government to the suspicions of having such people in his cabinet. And that's why I keep asking, who controls whom?
The alleged payments made to the Chief of Staff were done through a small private Maltese bank with an unusual business model. This bank, called Pilatus Bank, courted high net worth and politically connected clients, the kind who valued their secrecy above everything else. It was set up in 2014 by a man called Mr. Ali Sadr. He's from Iran, but 4 years earlier had acquired a second passport, this one from the tiny Caribbean island of St. Kitts and Nevis. But also in 2014, US authorities had begun sending out flares of caution.
The U.S. Department of Treasury issued an advisory in May 2014 warning the world and financial institutions that passports of the Caribbean nation of St. Kitts and Nevis, which one can acquire through investment without even bothering to reside in the island by basically paying down a significant amount of cash, those passports were being exploited by agents of the Iranian regime for the purpose of sanction evasion.
Dr. Emmanuel Ottolenghi works at a think tank in Washington and is an expert in illicit finance and sanction evasion.
Iran had identified the citizenship by investment programs available from Caribbean nations and increasingly from other countries as a way to provide their officials and their agents with a passport of convenience that would raise less concerns at banks and at ports of entries, wherever you needed to transit in order to establish businesses that could help the regime.
In March of this year, Ali Sadr was arrested by US authorities on charges of evading US sanctions against Iran, money laundering and bank fraud.
The fact that somebody washes up with a St. Kitts and Nevis passport who's Iranian, who's associated with a large business conglomerate doing infrastructure projects in Venezuela, a close ally of Iran, and a jurisdiction that had been involved in sanction evasion for Iran for a long time. All those were red flags.
So in 2014, the US Treasury are raising all these flags about sanction busting. But at the same time, Ali Sadr is setting up a bank in Malta.
It's very important for regulators to ask the tough questions that need to be asked. EU countries at the time still should have been exercising an enormous amount of enhanced due diligence with any Iranian coming in to do business, regardless of who they were and what they intended to do, and especially in banking. That Iranian national had a vast network of companies which were not entirely transparent. And that the possibility, therefore, was that the bank was being set up in the heart of the European Union in order to facilitate Iranian business.
Ali Sadr had acquired the St. Kitts passport through Henley and Partners, the company behind the Maltese citizenship scheme. US prosecutors say this passport was used to conceal his Iranian connections and therefore evade US sanctions. For Dr. Ottolenghi, it was the key that enabled Mr. Sadr to build his corporate empire.
I don't think that Ali Sadr would have been as successful in building this vast network of companies had it not been for the fact that he had access to a St. Kitts and Nevis passport. This is a critical tool for these types of illicit operations. It has been used extensively in many networks. And therefore, it's a concern that every country that has a citizenship by investment program needs to address.
Ali Sadr is currently in prison in the States awaiting trial. If found guilty, he could face up to 125 years in prison. His lawyers told us he couldn't answer our questions because of the upcoming court case, but we understand he intends to defend his case. Henley and Partners told us when Ali Sadr obtained a St. Kitts passport, it was done legally and with stringent due diligence. They added no amount of checks could guarantee the prevention of future crimes by anyone. They said it was regrettable that Ali Sadr turned out to possibly use the St. Kitts passport for nefarious purposes, and added it doesn't mean second citizenships are, per se, a bad thing. For MEP Ana Gomez, the perception that impunity reigns at the highest level of Maltese government continues to be a concern.
If you allow even the tiniest member of the EU, such as Malta, to operate a system where compliance doesn't really comply or is not effective, and where also the rule of law is not really functioning because there is no prosecutions of very serious cases of money laundering and of criminal behavior exposed, then of course this attracts all sorts of criminality from all over the world. And it's not just about infiltrating Malta, it's about infiltrating the EU. It affects us all.
This month, the European Commissioner for Justice will travel to Malta to investigate progress in the investigation into the assassination of Daphne Caruana Galicia and, amongst other things, the passport scheme. But Ali Sadr and Pilatus Bank didn't stop at Malta.
They established a branch here in Mayfair, one of London's richest neighbourhoods, where they had the entire second floor of this impressive period building, and they employed 7 staff. Now, once Ali Sadr was arrested in the US, the bank's assets were frozen by the Maltese regulator, so it never got the chance to officially open for business. And we've been told a couple of weeks ago the staff vacated the building.
The Pilates Bank story is concerning because this is a case where a bank opened in Malta under potentially questionable supervision has used EU passporting to open a branch in the United Kingdom.
Tom Keating is an expert in financial crime at the Royal United Services Institute. The question of how the bank was able to set up a branch in London at a time its chairman was under investigation for money laundering and sanction evasion is yet to be answered. But for him, the sale of citizenship was key.
This is an example, I would suggest, of the fact that if you want to be a successful sanctions evasioner, opening bank accounts around the world to facilitate the movement of money, then buying citizenship, buying residency is a great way of ensuring you succeed.
In Malta, the passport scheme may have nudged the budget from deficit to surplus, but in the UK it's an investment rather than a payment. So is there any real economic benefit?
It's important to note that the £2 million that is invested in government bonds, the government bonds are risk-free. You will get that money back. So you're not paying an entry ticket that you don't ever get back. You're lending money to the government, so you're making no real investment in the United Kingdom.
So it's less citizenship for sale than citizenship for a short-term loan?
We're granting residency to people in the UK for a short-term loan, yes.
Is that a good deal for Britain?
It's a terrible deal for Britain. It's an absolute terrible deal for Britain. When you consider how many people want to come and live in the United Kingdom, when you consider the lengths that people go to try and make it to the United Kingdom, £2 million for somebody who has many millions in the bank is chicken feed. It's not a good deal whatsoever.
The European Parliament has launched an inquiry into all citizenship schemes, including the UK one, as part of a wider probe into financial crime and tax evasion. But for Rachel Davies-Teka at Transparency International, the inherent risks in golden visa schemes mean they're just not a gamble worth taking.
When the government set up the scheme, they explicitly stated that it was for the aim of attracting the best and the brightest workers to come to Britain. But our analysis of how this has actually worked out doesn't seem to suggest that this is, in fact, what has happened. The UK government is talking a lot about what kind of global Britain do we want to be? Do we want to be known as a place that essentially does transactions with questionable individuals, or do we want to be a beacon of integrity, a place where there is a level playing field for all? And that decision is up to the government, and I hope they will make the right one.